Hello and welcome back. In this next video here, we're going to be building on the orange that we modeled in the last video, and we're going to start doing the surfacing to bring out the final bit of detail. So if you don't have your model open already, we're going to open up the orange 1 file from the video 02 folder in the content. And this next bit, we're going to be working with applying some procedural textures here to this object. So I think it's going to be a little bit easier if we're working in the render. So we're going to hit our Control tab and jump into our render and click the white arrow to turn on our preview. So one of the first things you notice about a lot of the oranges is they're really not perfectly round. They have just a little bit of variation to them. So the first thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding some noise. So we're going to go into our orange flesh, add a texture, and we're going to be adding noise. And I'm going to leave this at diffuse color so we can just see what we're doing with the noise first. Jump into the texture locator where we adjust its scaling and its mapping on there. I'm going to hit the equals gang edit here. I'm going to scale that texture up about 350 or so. Now I also want to jump back into the texture, and then the frequencies is set at 4, and that gives you lots of little details. We actually want this to be sort of more of a larger undulating sort of offset. So I'm going to move the frequencies down to 1 for the noise. Now I'm going to set that noise now to displacement. And if we go in here to the gang and we set that to, like, say 99, that'll give you sort of an idea of what it is that it's doing. It's just doing this soft sort of little undulating. I'm actually going to move that gain down to 80%. And maybe even that is still too strong. But we want just sort of that soft little bit of displacement on it. So it's not perfectly round. It just gives it a little bit of, just adds some randomness to the surface. So now that we have that in there, we're going to layer another layer of displacement on top of here. And this is going to be those little orange, those little dots. So I've done a lot of experimentation here, and if you actually look at orange skin close up, it looks like a bunch of little tiny dots. So I was trying to think of what procedural made a lot of sense that you could apply that would get that sort of look, and then it occurred to me that it was sort of like stars, lots of little dots. So we're going to go into the Enhance Modo Textures here. We're going to go into the space, and we're going to turn on Star Field. So I'm going to actually turn up the density to 0.9. Now we're going to set this guy up as displacement as well. So that is really sort of noisy and bumpy, and I think we actually want it to be the invert of what's going on here. We want to emphasize sort of the round bumpy part, not the points. And generally when you're adjusting a displacement, you would go into your material and you can control the displacement distance, but I don't want this to affect what I'm doing down here with the noise. So I'm going to control each layer's contribution to that individually by changing the opacity. So I'm going to put the opacity to these stars down to 20. So I think that is giving us, just right off the bat with very little tweaking at the default settings, a pretty good looking orange. But I want to emphasize sort of these flat areas more so than sort of the bumps. So generally what a displacement is doing is it's taking sort of the black values, the black to white, and the gray values, and it's deciding on that value how much it's going to displace the layer. So if you were to manipulate that gray shades in between, you can change the look of that displacement, and Modo has a function that does that, and that was with the Enhanced Modo Textures under waveforms. So I'm actually going to put a Fresnel, which is going to be kind of a nice curve. You need to set it to the exact same effect as your other layers. So we'll set that also to displacement, and that's going to just affect the layer directly below it. And you can see now it's really sort of affecting these flat out areas here, and it just has a bunch of just little tiny dots inside of there. It just makes it look a little bit more orangey, but it's really sort of displacing the surface a lot. So I'm going to also dial back its contribution. So it's going to be pretty subtle, but it actually is going to be making a difference. So I think that's what we want for the surface texture. It's looking pretty realistic now in terms of the quality, but the orange itself looks like it's painted. So let's start dealing with the surface qualities of the orange itself, now that we got this looking good. So in order to work with the surface qualities of the orange, I kind of like to work in something that's more than just a gray environment. Our default environment doesn't add a lot of variation to the surface. So we're going to go in here, we're just going to add an image really quick. Now this is an image that comes with the 901 content, but I'm including it here with this tutorial. Again, just so it's easier to find. So it's in the content folder, the Cherry Hill Road. Now I like this just because the bottom is kind of gray, so you don't get weird color directly from underneath, but you get nice color variations, this sort of wooded look outside, and then you get spotty trees and the light coming through. It just makes for an interesting lighting scenario. So I like the look of that, but I think having the image in the background can also be a little bit distracting. I'm going to select the environment item, and I'm just going to click off visible to camera. Excuse me. So now we're going to go in and we're going to start adjusting some of these material settings for our object. So I think we want to increase the specular here. Maybe try 18% on that. And I think Fresnel at 100 is too strong. I don't think anything really has perfect reflection 100% at the glancing angles. Now if we look at the orange reference images, all of them sort of have this sort of colored highlight. None of the highlights are really bright white. And the ones that are bright white sort of have this dual layer sort of thing. When you buy fruit at the store, oftentimes it's coated in wax just to make it shiny. So we sort of have that dual surface on there I think we're going to try and capture. So I think with the initial layer of specular, we're going to tint that sort of a yellowy orange color. And you can select whatever sort of yellowy orange color works for you. But that's going to sort of emphasize more that orangey look. You know, I think I might even dial back my star field displacement a little bit more. So by changing that opacity there to 10%. Alright, so now that we have a decent looking specular there, I'm going to jump in, I'm going to add in clear coat. I'm going to add in maybe 60% of clear coat. I'm going to give that a roughness of about 17. That'll kind of give you your dual layer of specular. So that'll be the specular that's shining off of the waxy layer. That'll give you kind of your white highlights. And then underneath you have your stronger specular, that is the orange one. That's going to be the specular that's actually on the orange skin. So this still has very much sort of a painted on look to it. And I think that's because we don't have light sort of going in. We don't have the subsurface scattering. And oranges are mostly liquid inside, so the light really penetrates it very deeply inside. So I think if we jump in here, we can turn on subsurface maybe to 80% and give this somewhat of an orangey color. Nice and saturated. Give us a strong, good-looking orange. Now, by default, it's only 5 millimeters as the scattering distance, and an orange, you know, this one's a meter in size, so we actually want to give this much deeper scattering. So I'm going to give that 200 millimeters there. That's going to make it glow, almost glow more. Oh, we're getting a good look here. So that's looking very orange-like. So one other little detail that I think I want to try and capture is if you look at skin really close up, the color of it varies. So you have sort of this yellowy orange to this sort of reddy orange, the little dots inside of there. And those are all the little, they're like little gel pockets that are inside of there. So I think we can sort of simulate that by duplicating our star field. So we're going to just duplicate that first. And we're going to set that to our diffuse color initially. And we want to make sure to turn our opacity back up to 100% on that guy. So I think we're going to keep our foreground color. Well, maybe we'll make it strong initially. And then we're going to create an instance of this guy. And that is going to be our subsurface color. And then we want to make sure to turn off invert in the original. So now we're getting this really sort of glowing red inside of here. And that's getting us a little bit closer to what we had originally. Or excuse me, it's getting us a little bit closer to what an actual orange looks like. But let's tweak these colors some. So since we instance it, we just need to change it in the one object and have it update automatically in the instance. That's the beauty of working with instances. Alright, we'll let that clean up a little bit. Maybe this is still a little bit too strong. Okay, so I think we got a fairly convincing looking skin now. So let's save this file. Save as. We're going to go into content and put this in video 3 orange 2. So I'm just going to overwrite my file so you can open up and look at exactly what it is I'm working on. So the next thing we need to work on is doing a little bit something here for this stem. So our displacement has pushed the surface out some. So we're going to need to pause that really quick, go into a perspective view here, and let's see what we can't do about selecting our stem object here. Just go into 5 to go into items mode, and then I'm going to go back to polygons mode so I'm working in the right layer. I'm just going to move that up. I'm going to eyeball it, I guess. Move that up just a little bit. See what that gets us. Oh, that's pretty good. So I think that gets it to look like it's basically resting on that surface. So I think we're pretty good right there. So we're going to do some texturing on this. So I think what we're going to do first, zoom in here. We get more of an idea, close-up of what that looks like. So if we look at some of our reference again of the stem, they kind of have a little yellowish here and with a little bit of green inside. So I think we can apply that using a gradient. And then we'll give that a size fall off. So we are done with our orange flesh. We're going to go into our stem material. And then we're going to add a gradient layer under image or under processing. Now, we're going to set this based on the distance to locator. So if we're in items mode, we can actually select our gradient item. And if we temporarily hide our stem, you can see the gradient is represented right there. The size is determined by these size values right here. So what it did is it automatically sized itself to the surface it's applying to. So we can turn back on our stem. And then we're going to go into our texture layers, and we want to make sure our input parameter is set correctly. So then we're going to go into sampling parameters, and we're just going to say distance to locator, and that's always the locator of the item itself. So since this is a color channel for diffuse color, we're going to go in here, and we're going to open in editor so we can get a better look at what it is we're doing. So I think it's kind of a green color at the core, not too saturated. We want it to look sort of green and fresh. So maybe we're not going to be sampling reality on this. And then we're going to need to get in here pretty close. I'm middle mouse button clicking here to add in a new key and then just selecting a new color. So I think we need that to get a lot closer here. And then I hit A basically just to line those all up. See, so we really sort of push that gradient since it's sort of spherical around the outside. So we'll select this color here. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And I like to add a couple of extra little tricks to add in some additional detail to it. Make it a little bit more convincing. So I think I'm going to add in some occlusion layers so it'll pay attention to sort of the surface of the object itself. So I think if we go in here and we set this to concavity, so if you think about a cave, this will add in some shading here into these caved in sort of inaccessible areas, sort of like a dirt shader. And I think make that smaller, maybe a little bigger. We're going to set that color to green, like a darker green, and we're going to multiply that as a blending mode over the top of what's there. Now I want to add a little bit more detail around the outer edge, so let's put in another occlusion layer. And this one we're going to set to convexity, so that would be the opposite of concavity. So that I think we're going to give sort of a tan yellowy color. This one we're going to set to black. And this one we're going to set to add, I believe. And also get that occlusion distance. So it's just adding in some sort of variation that fits in with the surface. So like I said earlier, we're not going in for extreme realism. If you wanted to go in and paint some details on here, you're free to do that. Actually, what we can do, and is a great idea for what we're going to need later on, is we can bake this all to a texture map so you can manipulate that a little bit easier. I think if we actually scale some of this back, the effects won't be quite so strong. Sort of unify it with that underlaying color. All right, so in the final image, this is going to be moving around. We're going to be using some dynamics to position these guys. And this little stem of the orange is no longer going to be in a position relative to that gradient locator anymore. So we're going to actually need to bake this texture in order for it to move along with the orange. So we're going to jump into our UV edit here really quick. And just to be safe, let's save. So we got our object selected. Turn off our background orange. And let's look at the UV map. Go into the list view here and look at the UV map. So this is the UV map that was automatically generated by Modo when we created the object. And that's not really great for our purposes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new UV map for this guy. So we're going to be in polygons mode. And what I want to do is I want to define a seam basically to split apart the top and bottom. So I'm just going to go into edges mode here actually. Double click on that loop. And then we're going to get the unwrap tool. And then click. Yeah. So that is what we get with the unwrap tool. And I think we can improve that by using relax. So let's see what we get with adaptive. Yeah, that looks more like what the object is. So let's position this. This is the bottom section, which isn't really important to us. We can scale that down some using the move and scale, which are the W and R keys. And double clicking in the UV view on any of the polygons will select the entire island. So W to move, E to rotate, and R to scale. You want to make sure none of these parts for baking, anyways, are overlapping. Like I said, the bottom part isn't very important because we're never going to see it in our final rendered, so we can actually make this a lot smaller. So there, we've made a very simple, easy UV map that we can use for baking. So we're going to save that again. We're going to go back to the orange stem, and we're going to add in an image map. So that is done by using the new image. I'm going to go into the textures, and we're going to call this texture orange stem underscore diff. And I think that can just be a regular 8-bit PNG file. It's my favorite format. Doesn't need to be very big, so we're going to make that 512. No alpha, so that's just going to be RGB. Click OK. Now we don't want that to actually contribute to the baking, so we're going to turn that off. And then what we do is we just right click on this guy, and then we just say bake to texture. That'll use the render engine to bake out those layers, the occlusion and the gradient, into that texture map. And then we want to make sure that we right click and save that image, because what we initially saved was just the blank image. So now that we've generated the pixels, so you see it's kind of a little bit noisy, so we can go into our occlusion layers, select both of those, and we can change up our occlusion rays to a much higher level, and we'll bake that again. Be a little bit slower this time, obviously, but we're going to get a lot smoother results. Alright, so we can turn that layer on, turn those layers off. Make sure we save that. So let's go back to our render layout. So I think in the material, we want a little bit of subsurface. I think anything that's sort of living and organic is going to have a little bit of subsurface to it. So I'm going to give that maybe 30% subsurface. Give that a green color. And we'll see what that looks like with our orange. So once we see that in context with our orange, it's looking pretty good. So like I said, you know, I'm setting the framework for your understanding of how to do this. Then you can take this if you'd like, and then really sort of push that photorealistic. So you could take this and go into the painting tab now and paint on some additional details. I might do that myself on this, but I think for this portion of the tutorial now, we have ourselves a fairly good looking orange, and we will obviously be tweaking that later on, but I think we are done with surfacing the orange. So in conclusion, we were able to use some procedural textures to manipulate them in order to get a nice realistic effect on our orange, applying some displacement. We used some different procedural textures for our stem, and we baked that into a UV map that we created. So it's all very quick, fairly easy to do stuff. In the next video, we're going to be taking what we did with the orange. We're going to be taking that and then turning that into a lemon. So since they're both part of the citrus family, we're going to need to do some tweaking to the shape of that and obviously the colors to turn that into a lemon. So that's what we'll do in the next video.